Wouldn't that be pretty much absurd and in your face? And yet, that's exactly what we do with a very popular program called the Pell Grant program. The Pell Grant was created in the 1970s and has since become the basic mechanism for the federal government to assist lower-income families with higher education costs. The legislation mandates that students receiving the funds must be admitted and enrolled in an institution of higher learning. Fine. While the Pell Grant provides great opportunity for students who might not otherwise be able to attend college, something that we all think is good, the waste comes from a stipulation that within the law that requires the federal government to pay a fee to give away their money. The $5 payment goes directly to participating schools and is intended to help offset the cost of the Pell Grant. So we let institutions of higher learning charge a fee to accept your money, the taxpayers. While it's true that there are administrative costs involved with servicing Pell Grants, schools should accept these costs as a part of doing business as they would if no Pell Grant were provided and it was just your hard-earned money as you were supporting one of your children in college. Those fees would be incorporated within that same $1,000. For the 2015 and 16 year, the maximum Pell Grant available to an undergraduate student was roughly $5,775. And based on the latest reports from the U.S. Department of Education for the same year, or for the year prior, the nation's taxpayers provided $30 billion to 8 million students. The average Pell Grant received to students was roughly $3,800. That all sounds good. While $5 does not seem significant, when you put that $5 towards 8 million students, you can see where the problem is. It is an unnecessary, arbitrary, and should be a fee that should be disallowed, and we need to restore it so that colleges and institutions do not scoop something off of the top. But people say, well, we have our administrative costs, we have overhead, we have our infrastructure, we have all of these things that we have to do. Yes, and that's why we have allowed for decades the tax-exempt endowments, so that as the endowments accrue wealth and they grow, they use those resources to sustain the infrastructure on the university. $20 trillion in debt. It would be great, as we could not pay our bills, we go to our next and say, hey, you know, I'm a little short on my electric bill. Can you help me? I need help on my house payment this month. Let me just get it from you. Our neighbors would not take kindly to that, and yet we are allowing these institutions who have the endowed wealth, who have all of the ability to do the infrastructure, and yet what happens? They continue to waste money with administrative fees that only have increased by 300% since 1976. Here's another one for you. How many of you would donate to a charity that had a 52% administrative overhead? No takers? Didn't think so. And yet that's exactly what you do when you have the National Science Foundation put forth research grants that were designed to help people in their health and fighting disease and many other things. The average fee that universities and institutions charge back to the federal government for these research grants is 52%. That borders on the immoral. A practice in higher education grant making that is not widely known or understood by the American public is this practice of charging indirect cost as a part of a grant. So, for example, $1 million that is coming to a university for research, we're all excited about that. It helps our communities. Did you know that that university, in turn, will scoop, on average, 52% off of the top? The typical grant has direct cost, and we all understand that as they put forth their budget. And they will list it with such things as researchers' salaries, fine, travel associated with research, understood. But beyond that, universities are able to claim under our insane laws that additional funds in the form of indirect cost are needed for infrastructure of the institution. Our responsibility as taxpayers to support that. Never mind that tax-free endowments were designed specifically for that purpose and already exist that they could use, but they never touch that wealth, they never touch that accrued wealth, they never touch that accrued interest. The Office of Management of Budget defines indirect costs as expenses an organization incurs indirectly, and they get to define what that is. What does it translate to? Well, rather than pick on Harvard, let's just pick on the Big 12, a region that I come from, and we'll start with the University of Oklahoma. Charging the government for indirect costs is expensive and unfortunately a common practice among institutions of higher learning. Here are the indirect costs for the schools in the Big 12, and I'm sure they're not the only ones. This is a nationwide epidemic to the tune of $55 billion. That's billion with a B. Even in Washington, D.C., that is real money. University of Oklahoma adds a 55% surcharge to its research on campus. Oklahoma State University, 45%, and 54% surcharge for instruction grant projects. University of Texas, 56%. We have a winner. Texas Tech, 49%. Texas Christian, 54%. Baylor, 38%. They're a little more economical, but it's still nearly 40% of waste. The University of Kansas charges a surcharge of 51.5%. Kansas State, 52%. West Virginia, 50%. Iowa State, 52%, meeting the median average. Higher education officials rarely talk about it, and when confronted with it, they will, with straight faces and degrees of education, argue that this waste is absolutely essential for them to continue to do. A recent George Washington University student newspaper article revealed education officials' thoughts about indirect costs when he overtly referred to them as, you got it, subsidies. He let it slip. Maybe Freudian, we don't know. The George Washington Hatchet quoted Leah Chalupa, Vice President for Research, that, quote, research is bringing in money to the university. You think? $55 billion worth. However, Chalupa is not just referring to the direct dollars used to conduct research. We would all agree with needed research. But what we don't agree with is this indirect, more than half plundering of what the dollars were designed and intended to do. Let's switch to something that we should do to try to incentivize people to improve their educational experience. Sound confusing? It is. To the tune of $7 billion that was wasted, few Americans will argue that the nation's schools do not need improvement. We would all say that they do. Whether one looks at test scores or compares American outcomes with